Mr. President, I rise to talk about the important agreement that we're debating here on the Senate floor, the Iran nuclear agreement. And I wanted to begin by saying there seems to be, as we debate this, as we hold hearings, a growing sense of frustration as we do what is really our sacred duty here in the United States Senate to review this agreement, to debate this agreement, and ultimately to vote on this agreement, whether it's something that's going to keep our country secure or undermine the national security of the United States and our allies. And this frustration stems from a number of sources, but let me just name a few. First is I think many Democrats and Republicans feel that there's been a dismissive attitude from the administration with regard to this agreement. A dismissive attitude actually towards the American people on whether the United States Congress should weigh in on this agreement, should represent their constituents on something that's this important to the national security of the United States of America. And I mention this because if you look at the last several months, every step of the way, the administration has tried to cut out the role of the Congress. Initially, they said, executive agreement. Congress, you're going to have no role. No role. Well, I don't think our constituents like that. Certainly the United States Senate didn't like that, so we started debating the Iranian Nuclear Agreement Review Act. The President said he was going to veto that. Again, dismissive of this body and the American people. Fortunately, this body had a very strong veto-proof majority, so we're debating it. But not because they wanted us to debate it, because we're representing our constituents who know how important this is. Then the agreement is taken to the United Nations before we weigh in on it at all. Members of the United Nations, citizens from other countries, voting on this agreement before we had the opportunity. Again, bipartisan, Democrats, Republicans. Mr. President, Secretary Kerry, don't do that. That's an affront to the American people. But they did it. So we're debating it, and that's important. But that attitude of dismissiveness of this body and the people we represent is frustrating. Mr. President, there's a second reason there's a frustration in the Senate. And it stems from the fact that we're not sure that we're getting the straight scoop. We're not sure that we're getting all the documents. The law now requires every document related to this agreement to come before this body. And yet, we find out 2 weeks ago that there's a very important agreement. The agreement between the IAEA and Iran on implementation of this agreement. How did we find out about that? One of my colleagues, Senator Cotton, got on a plane, went to IAEA headquarters in Vienna. He found that out. Again, frustration. We're not having all the documents as required by law to be able to review. And third, Mr. President, in terms of frustration, there's a sense that as we are doing our duty here, as we are digging into this agreement, as we are reading it, as we are reaching out to experts, as we are trying to understand it, as we are questioning administration witnesses at hearings, as we're doing our required and sacred due diligence, we're told time and again that the plain language of the agreement doesn't appear to mean what it means. And this is frustrating. And this is particularly true with regard to sanctions. So let me give you a few examples. First, we had a closed briefing. Almost every member of the Senate came to that briefing a couple of weeks ago. And there was a big question. Was there a grandfather provision with regard to sanctions? Meaning, if you're a company and you rush to Iran right now and cut some deals, and sanctions are later imposed, the mere fact that you jumped in early, are you grandfathered away from these sanctions? Well, a lot of people had questions. The Secretary of State looked at 100 members of the United States Senate and said, there is no grandfather clause in this agreement. There is no grandfather clause in this agreement. Mr. President, this is paragraph 37 of the agreement. And I'm just going to quote it, because it certainly sounds like a grandfather clause to me. In such event that sanctions are reimposed, these provisions in this paragraph would not apply with retroactive effect to contracts signed between any party and Iran or Iranian individuals and entities prior to the date of application. That's when the agreement starts to be implemented. So, that sounds like a grandfather clause. Now, maybe there's elements here, maybe there's special circumstances that make it not a grandfather clause, but the Secretary of State was in front of all of us saying there's no grandfather clause. It's hard to square that with the plain language of this agreement. Let me give you another example, Mr. President. The much touted snapback provision in the agreement. Secretary Lew, the Secretary of the Treasury, has talked about how we have a strong snapback provision, how it's going to be prompt, how it's powerful. These are terms that he's been using in testimony. In many ways, I think members of this body, Democrats and Republicans, see the effectiveness of this entire deal might hinge on this so-called snapback provision. But the more I read about our sanctions and how they work in this agreement, the more questions I have. Because, Mr. President, to me, the snapback provision seems to be an illusion. It actually seems to be aimed back at the United States. I don't think we should be calling it a snapback provision. Maybe it should be called the boomerang provision, because it's aimed at us. Let me talk a little bit more in detail about this. First, the term snapback is not in the agreement. It's a good term, it's catchy, sounds good. It's actually a term used in trade negotiations. When a party violates a trade agreements will have snapback provisions where we raise tariffs on goods immediately. That is a snapback. But that's not what's going on here. That's not what's going to happen here. The practical reality of sanctions, particularly economic sanctions, is that there's no snap when you put them in. It's a slog. Let me give you an example. In my experience, Mr. President, I worked with many people at the beginning of our efforts in the Bush administration, 2006, 2007, 2008, to start economically isolating Iran. What does that mean? Well, what we did, we leveraged the power of the United States economy in close coordination with the Congress of the United States, and we went to countries and companies that were big investors in Iran, say in the oil and gas sector, and we told them that they needed to start divesting out of the largest sponsor of terrorism in the world. Or the Congress of the United States might look to sanction their company or limit their access to the American market. We were leveraging the authority of the Congress and the power of our economy to get countries, yes, many of whom were our allies, Norway, Germany, France, Japan, to divest and economically isolate Iran. Mr. President, that took months, that took years. It was a slog. There was no snap. So what do we see today? European companies, it's in the paper every day, European CEOs, I believe, senior administration officials in Germany, government officials, are already in Tehran. Already. Companies looking to set up shop, looking to invest billions as they did before. They're there now. This deal isn't even done yet. And they're there. They can't wait, licking their chops, to reinvest in the biggest terrorist regime in the world. It's done more to kill Americans than probably any other country in the world in the last 30 years. Of course, this is disappointing, but this history is a reminder to all of us that the sanctions regime that Secretary Kerry talks about, that we certainly did have Iran surrounded in terms of sanctions, that was 110% American-led sanctions regime. Democrats, Republicans, this Congress, the Bush administration, and yes, a lot of credit to the Obama administration on this economic isolation of Iran, which is what brought him to the table to begin with. So if we reimpose sanctions, there certainly won't be a snap when it happens. It will be slow. It will be a slog again, trying to convince reluctant Europeans, Russians, Chinese to pull out of the market once again. But finally, Mr. President, I just want to say one other thing, and it goes again back to the plain language of the agreement, where again the snapback provision, so-called snapback provision, seems aimed back at us, the boomerang provision. I've posed a hypothetical to Secretary Kerry, Secretary Lew in a closed session and a Senate Armed Services session yesterday to try and get specifics on what would happen in certain situations. So I gave him this hypothetical. Let's assume sanctions are lifted in the next 6 to 9 months. These are called Annex II sanctions. It is a huge list of sanctions. The most powerful sanctions that our country has placed on Iran, all of them, financial, oil, market, they're going to be lifted 6 to 9 months. Let's assume that happens. As we're already seeing, European companies, other countries, certainly Chinese, Russian, Japanese, are going to be rushing into this market, investing billions once again. Assume the Iranian economy is going to start humming. With all this new investment, the lifting of sanctions, a senior Iranian official recently said they're looking for $120 billion of new investment by 2020. And they're likely going to get a lot of it. And they're abiding by the deal. No violations of any of the nuclear aspects of this deal. And then, what I think is very likely, sometime within the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, Iran commits a major act of terrorism. Let's say they kill more American troops. Let's say they blow up a consulate or embassy somewhere. They are the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, and it doesn't look like they want to do anything but continue to do that. So that's a very likely scenario. When that happens, this body reapplies sanctions. It looks at Annex II, some of our most powerful sanctions. We are very upset, bipartisan. We reapply sanctions. The president, whoever that is, signs it, because that president, he or she, is very upset. And we reimpose serious Annex II sanctions. Now, what happens then? Well, I think what's going to happen very likely at that point is Iran is going to look at this agreement and they're going to cite either paragraph 26 or paragraph 37. Let me read you both of those. Again, this is the plain language of the statute. Paragraph 37. Iran has stated that if sanctions are reinstated in whole or in part, Iran will treat that as grounds to cease performing its commitments under the entire agreement. Another provision. Iran has stated that it will treat the reintroduction or reimposition of the sanctions specified in Annex 2 as grounds to cease performing its commitments under the agreement. That's in the agreement. So you see, Mr. President, if we reimpose sanctions as part of the snapback, Iran can look at this agreement and say, I'm done. I'm walking. I can legally leave this agreement. They can legally leave this agreement with a humming economy, on the verge of a breakout of a nuclear weapon, still being the largest state sponsor of terrorism, and they can say, hey, I complied with the agreement. The United States reimposed sanctions. I told them what I was going to do, and they do it. So again, bottom line, if we use the so-called snapback provision, it certainly appears from the language of this agreement that the deal is done. So I've asked Secretary Kerry and Secretary Liu twice now, how is that an improper reading of the agreement? Well, Secretary Liu, Secretary of the Treasury, he's trying to argue that we're reading that language wrong. He says Annex 2 sanctions, the big American sanctions that are really what's kept Iran down and what's brought them to the table, they can be reimposed if they're reimposed for non-nuclear violations, like terrorism. Well, when I read this agreement, that seems to be a bit of a stretch. Certainly there's a lot of ambiguity, but it's also clear that the Iranians clearly won't agree with that reading. They don't agree with that reading. Mr. President, this was filed, and I ask unanimous consent to submit it for the record.
Objection.
This is an Iranian letter dated 20 July 2015 to the United Nations Security Council, and it's their interpretation of the agreement. You want to know what the Iranians say about the reimposition of so-called snapback sanctions? Here's what they say. Quote, it is clearly spelled out in the agreement that both the European Union and the United States will refrain from reintroducing or reimposing the sanctions, now they're talking about Annex 2 sanctions, and restrictive measures lifted under the agreement. It is understood that reintroduction or reimposition, including through extension of the sanctions and restrictive measures, will constitute significant non-performance which would relieve Iran from its commitments in whole or in part of this agreement. My colleague, Senator Ayotte from New Hampshire, yesterday asked Secretary Kerry and Secretary Liu about this provision. They didn't give a clear answer because there is no clear answer. Right now, there's huge disagreement between the United States and Iran and the language in the agreement on whether, what degree these snapback provisions, so-called snapback provisions, will work or will undermine our national security interests, which is what I believe they will do. So I've asked the administration to quit using that term. It's not in the agreement. The language makes clear that it's going to take years. There's no snap. And that if we ever use it, that's it for the agreement. And they have not given the members of this body a straightforward answer on that issue. So, Mr. President, we need to keep asking these kind of questions. We need to keep doing our due diligence. But we need clarity. The American people need clarity, not spin, on critical issues such as this side IAEA agreement, which nobody seems to have read, and we certainly haven't seen. The grandfather clause, which certainly looks like a grandfather clause, but is now, we're told by Secretary Kerry, is not a grandfather clause. And perhaps most importantly, this so-called snapback provision, which is, I believe, is illusory and is aimed at us, not at the pariah state that we're all concerned about, and that's Iran. Mr. President, I yield the floor.